In the one version of King Lear, the scene on the heath is there. In the other version of King Lear, it's not. So what's the solution? The solution is, obviously, starting in 1709 with the first, was scientific for his day, editor of King Lear. The obvious solution is to combine them. And from then on, until a French scholar who was editing Shakespeare between 1859 and 1865, and who was completely forgotten for 150 years, nobody considered that maybe you needed to pay attention to different versions of the text. Is it possible that in Russian schools there is a school play every year? No? Yes?
Yes.
So how many of you have been in a play? Even if it's sewing the costume or pulling on a rope. Okay. When you're rehearsing a play, it changes while you're rehearsing it, because you say, I don't understand what this line means, or you say, let's just cut that scene, it's too long. And that's what happened in Shakespeare's theater. Shakespeare was there every day. He was an actor, he was a shareholder, called a sharer. And are my 2 minutes up?
No.
I can finish the sentence. You realize I have reduced you to the state of children who want to say, and then what happened? Okay, well, and then what happened is he made changes. Also, there are 3 Hamlets. Hamlet is the nightmare of every editor. There are 2 Richard III's. The reason there are 3 Hamlets is that there's a touring script, which has all the good stuff in it, none of the soliloquies, unless they've been really shortened, because if you're on tour in the countryside, you look for a pub, you take a bunch of barrels of beer, and then you put wooden planks over them, and you've got a stage. But that's all you have. You have no scenery, you have no special effects, no nothing. So you have to have some kind of script that will catch people's imagination. And you do this in the courtyard of a pub because you can charge people as they're coming in, just so that you get a little whiff of 16th and early 17th century dramatic capitalism. So, did Shakespeare set a standard? No. But yes. And the reason it's no and yes is because standard is a monolith that you're using without thinking about it. So rethink the question. And here's the answer you would get. There are already plays based on history and legend. There are lots of them. Most of them don't survive. Fortunately for us, there's a list because there was an office, a royal office, and the play scripts had to pass censorship. You thought it was a Russian specialty? Oh no. And so we have lots of lists about what was performed only in London during a long period around the turn of the 16th to the 17th centuries. So there were lots of these, but not enough whose texts survive. One by Marlowe in 2 parts. 3, and another one by Marlowe, Edward II. It's also always a possibility that our greatest writers will steal from somebody else. And in an age without copyright, that's not a difficult thing to do. So Shakespeare used the old chronicle history of King Lear. And he certainly looked at some of the little mini biographies that you get starting with Boccaccio. He read a lot, and he had a very unusually good memory. After the closing of the theaters, there's nothing for 20 years. And with the Restoration, you start to get different kinds of plays, not least because the court has been in Paris. And in Paris, shock, horror, they have women on the stage. So the English theater ceases to be a travesty theater. You would not expect women acting in public, though you did get women acting in private theatricals in Shakespeare's England. Next question. Tell us another story. No. Stories are over for this morning. Yes?
Some question connected maybe not with this particular play, but genealogy.
Yes.
Are modern people in Britain interested in their own family genealogy? Do they?
There's no place in the world that they're not. Everybody.
But particular interested, maybe not aristocrats, but ordinary
people.
Do they the same trees? I don't know.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah. It's extraordinary. Apparently, I must have skipped this. Apparently, in their 50s, people often start getting interested in the history of their families. And in England, this is much easier than it is in other places because there are records and they've survived, including in churches. Because you went to church, you got married, you signed the book that was in your church. My mouth is open. All pictures of me have my mouth open. So you can, if you know where your parents were married, you can look it up. And I think many of these parish registers were turned into microfilm, which is horrible to read. But they're rapidly being put up on the web by people all over the place. And they find that they have relatives they never dreamt of. One of my fellow Shakespeareans discovered that she is a cousin of Calvin Klein. She was very interested in this. He was not. Yes.
And Geoffrey of Monmouth. Was
Yes.
he actually the first person who mentioned King Lear?
Perhaps. The problem about being the first to do something is we don't always know, we always do not know what has not survived. However, I have brought some copies of what Geoffrey of Monmouth writes, so you can certainly have one. I'll sort it out later on. The figure that Geoffrey of Monmouth is really interested in is King Arthur. So what has happened, because everybody's interested in King Arthur, and not everybody is interested in King Lear, is that there's been a lot of editing where you only get the part about King Arthur. This is the ancestor of the Game of Thrones. And so that's very familiar. There's an Everyman volume which has the Arthurian bits in it, which you can probably access one way or another. And I often feel that I would like to ask my students, especially the really geeky ones, to find something for me and not tell me that it's completely illegal. But thus far, I've managed to resist it. I'm sure you could find a volunteer and you wouldn't even have to ask. Okay, at this point when I'm talking to people whose language I don't speak, It always, or indeed in France, it's always really embarrassing to ask something. So here's what I propose to do. People who are really hungry and put lunch above study should leave now. And people who want to ask a question or listening to somebody brave who asks a question should stay, and I'll talk to you. In fact, I'll talk to you in your lunch canteen if you would like me to, or not, because that's quite scary. But you decide and tell me what you want, and that's what we'll do. Would you like me to leave the room while you have a democratic discussion?
Okay, so shall we invite the professor to our dining area?
Yes, but it's very noisy. But they have delicious food.
The professor is extremely flattered.